Welcome to That Happened, the channel that explores unique and unbelievable aviation and spaceflight history. In this video, we'll be covering 5 times severely damaged aircraft defied the odds and kept flying. If you're new to the channel and at some point during this video feel like you would enjoy more of this type of content, I invite you to please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. But first, enjoy a rare collection of flight disasters where almost nobody dies. Boasting a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.17 to 1, the F-15 Eagle can not only maintain a vertical climb, it can accelerate while doing it. Such incredible power also gives this air superiority fighter another brag-worthy skill: the ability to fly with only one wing. In May 1983, the Israeli Air Force was conducting an air combat training session between 2 F-15s and 4 A-4 Skyhawks, when there was a mid-air collision between 2 of the aircraft. The A-4 pilot managed to safely eject as his plane came apart, while the 2-seat F-15 was thrown into an uncontrolled spinning dive. The Eagle crew was preparing to eject when the pilot decided to throttle up, which miraculously slowed the spin and brought the plane level again, giving them time to assess the damage and decide a course of action. Fuel was obviously leaking, confirmed by both the gauges and the plume of vapor that could be seen coming out the right side of the aircraft. But other than that, there were no warning lights indicating a problem. Yes, it seems F-15 manufacturer McDonnell Douglas had neglected to add a missing wing light to their cockpits. The nearest airfield was just 10 miles away, but for a reason still unknown to the crew, to maintain a steady flight path, this F-15 was being forced to come in at twice the recommended landing speed. The pilot lowered his arresting hook and called the tower to ask them to erect the safety net. Slowing before touchdown was not going to be an option. At a speed of 260 knots, the hook caught the arresting cable and was immediately ripped from the fuselage. But the pilot still managed to bring the plane to a stop 30 feet short of the emergency netting. At that point, the 2 men were finally able to see the extent of the damage. The leaking fuel had obscured both the crew and their wingmen from realizing the wing wasn't just damaged, it wasn't there at all. Later, the pilot would say that had he known the truth about his situation, he would have ejected immediately, adding that it's obvious you shouldn't keep trying to fly a plane with only one wing. When McDonnell Douglas first heard of the incident and saw the pictures, they thought it had to be a taxiing accident, or perhaps someone just trying to play a joke on them. But later, wind tunnel tests confirmed the claim. Due to the thrust and lift generated by the large body of the aircraft, flying an F-15 with one wing was actually possible, though only within a limited speed and angle of attack. And if you think about it, the math checks out. Losing a wing can only improve your thrust-to-weight ratio. During peacetime or civilian operations, an aircraft losing its vertical stabilizer is a rare occurrence, but also a fatal one. One example being the November 2001 American Airlines Flight 587 that lost its tail shortly after takeoff and plunged into a neighborhood of Queens, New York. But back in 1964, a B-52H Stratofortress suffered a similar structural failure with a surprisingly different result. In a weird twist of fate, the purpose of the B-52's flight on that day was to evaluate airframe stresses in specific low-level situations. Thus, the aircraft was crewed by Boeing test pilots and equipped with sensors recording aerodynamic loads on key surfaces. A few hours into the flight, while passing over the mountains of Colorado, the aircraft experienced 9 seconds of clear air turbulence. These gusts were later confirmed to be of a greater magnitude than had ever been previously recorded on any large aircraft. After the turbulence had passed, the plane continued to buck and roll, while the flight crew struggled with unresponsive rudder and elevator controls. No one really knew what the issue was, but abandoning the aircraft was looking to be the only option left. That is, until a transfer of fuel to the forward tanks and the deployment of the air brakes suddenly steadied their flight. Still unclear of the extent of the damage, the Boeing pilots called in chase planes to inspect the aircraft. And what they saw explained the rudder problems pretty well. 85% of the B-52's vertical stabilizer was missing, ripped from the fuselage due to the force of the turbulence. And yet somehow, the plane was still flying. Despite the extensive damage, it was decided that the B-52 would try to make it home. At the request of Boeing engineers on the ground, the rear landing gear was deployed, which immediately helped increase directional stability. Meanwhile, to make up for the lack of rudder, directional control was maintained by varying the throttles of the 8 turbofan engines. High winds at their home base in Wichita, Kansas meant the Stratofortress crew had to divert to Arkansas, extending their slow, tailless flight to over 5 hours. Fortunately, the Boeing test pilots were able to bring the aircraft and its valuable sensor data in for an uneventful landing at Blytheville Air Force Base. As a result, Boeing was able to use this information to explain the losses of previous aircraft and strengthen and improve the vertical stabilizers of its B-52 fleet. In 1988, Aloha Airlines was flying not one, but 2 of the most experienced 737s in the world. These island-hopping planes had accumulated almost 90,000 pressurization cycles, 15,000 more than was intended for the service life of the airframe. On April 28th, one of these 19-year-old 737s was on its 7th flight of the day and cruising at an altitude of 24,000 feet when disaster struck. Due to extreme metal fatigue, a failure along one of the joints in the fuselage opened a crack in the skin of the aircraft. Explosive decompression did the rest. As the pressurized air rushed out of the plane cabin through the hole, the massive force ripped the top off the first-class cabin, exposing 6 rows of seats and their occupants to the 400-kilometer-an-hour jet stream. One stewardess, Carabelle Lansing, was immediately sucked out. But thankfully, everyone else had their seatbelts on and remained with the aircraft. Due to the loss of structural reinforcement, the cockpit had dropped more than 3 feet and snapped several floor beams. But amazingly, it still remained attached to the rest of the airframe. Captain Schornsteimer immediately began an emergency descent, the wind noise in the cockpit so extreme they couldn't even talk to each other. Slowing down and leveling off at 10,000 feet reduced the noise and allowed the crew to call in their emergency. As they descended into Maui, the pilots were still unaware of just how damaged their plane really was. 35 square meters of fuselage was missing, and the wings and tail had been hammered by the wreckage. As well, both engines had ingested metal debris. And to add to that list, as they made their final approach, the left engine quit. Its throttle cable snapped by the buckling floor. But against all odds, Captain Schornsteimer and First Officer Tompkins were able to bring their crippled plane and its occupants safely back to the ground. Of the 95 on board, there were 64 people injured, 8 of them critically. But the only fatality was the unfortunate stewardess. All in all, an impressive and unexpected result for a commercial airplane that flew for 13 harrowing minutes, looking like this. Our next story is about a legendary bomber that both inspired a new emblem for its squadron and gave us one of the most famous photographs of World War II. On February 1st, 1943, the crew of the B-17F Flying Fortress, All-American, had dropped their bomb load on the Mediterranean seaports of Bizerta and Tunis and were now turning to begin the 300-mile trip back to their base in Algeria. The planes of the 414th Bombardment Squadron had survived heavy flak on the way in, but on the way out, these unescorted bombers faced a new challenge: German fighter aircraft. 2 Me-109s began their head-on attack run against the lead B-17 and the All-American, which was flying next to it in the formation. The first enemy plane was quickly taken out by the concentrated fire of the bomber formation, while the second German fighter zeroed in on the All-American, its guns blazing. Just as the plane was about to pass over the B-17, one of the gunners scored a critical hit at the worst possible moment. The disabled plane was now unable to complete its roll away from the All-American, and instead collided with the large aircraft. Its wing cut through the rear of the plane like a knife, severing the left stabilizer and almost completely removing the entire tail section from the aircraft. Amazingly, none of the crew, including the tail gunner, were injured, and the plane was still flying. The other bombers closed in around the stricken plane, and it was at that moment a navigator in another B-17 snapped the famous shot. No doubt thinking to himself, this could be the last moments that the All-American was still all in one piece. But the plane miraculously held together for the entire flight home. During landing, the tail wheel wouldn't go down, but other than that, the touchdown was uneventful. Once on the ground, several more iconic pictures were taken of the damaged tail section, which finally broke free and fell off when ground personnel climbed aboard to inspect the plane. The story of this legendary B-17 flight would inspire a new emblem that was adopted for the 414th a year later. It showed a praying dog in the tail section of a similarly damaged plane. Meanwhile, the All-American was fitted with a new tail and continued to fly as a utility and transport aircraft until it was scrapped in March 1945. You can't make a video like this and neglect talking about one of the toughest single-engine fighters ever built, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The problem is, when a plane has the historic legacy of resilience like the P-47, which story do you pick? This was the type of aircraft where oil seemed optional, where groves of trees weren't worthy of being avoided during your strafing run, and where flak damage was just considered to be speed holes. My choice seemed like it was finally made when I came upon this incredible picture. But as I read through the details of the story attached to it, I started to have my doubts about the authenticity of the claims. And when further research turned up this undoctored version of the same image, I knew I had to look into this further before I included this tale in my video in good conscience. The good news is, after looking into the facts, I do believe this event did happen, but not in the way it has been told and retold in articles and videos over the years. So, I would now like to present to you the real story of a P-47 that flew home with half a wing. Amazingly, the pilot in this story is not one of the common exaggerations. Raimondo da Costa Canario was actually just 18 years and 8 months old when he arrived in Italy in January 1945, making him probably one of the youngest fighter pilots in the whole theater. Raimondo was part of a group of Brazilian aviation cadets that had been trained in the United States, which I was able to confirm through both military records and a memorial Facebook page that is specifically dedicated to his life and achievements. Once stationed in Italy, the Brazilian Air Force P-47s were tasked with fighter bomber missions, supporting Allied ground forces as they pushed into northern Italy, which is where we find Raimondo da Costa Canario about a month into his tour. Now, some retellings would have you believe this all began with Raimondo making 3 passes on enemy positions and taking out 3 German Tiger tanks in succession. To me, right away it seemed a little too specific and convenient to start this story with the destruction of 3 of the most recognizable pieces of the German war machine. And more reliable sources are on my side, describing the situation instead as an attack on armored vehicles without specifics or claims of successes. It is during one of these strafing runs that disaster strikes and Raimondo's right wing clips a chimney. At such high speeds and low altitude, the result of such a strike would usually be abrupt and explosive. But amazingly, the P-47 keeps flying, though now with 1.2 meters or almost 4 feet of the plane's wing missing. From here, the story gets a little murky. One version has Raimondo being jumped by a few RAF Spitfires who mistake his now unusual profile for a German plane. As his radio is broken, he is unable to identify himself, and either gets shot up a bit before they realize their mistake, or he hits the throttle and outruns them on 1.5 wings, returning to his base in England, which is a surprising turn of events seeing that the Brazilian Air Force was operating in Italy. Raimondo da Costa Canario's 1997 obituary retells the wing loss story, but has no mention of any friendly fire. Instead, it does name his wingman, a Lieutenant Dornelis, who flew the B-4 plane. Allegedly, Dornelis flew by Raimondo's side all the way back to base, but as they made their approach, a message comes through Raimondo's apparently not broken radio. The P-47s are told to hold off on landing, as there is an American P-61 Black Widow in worse condition that has priority to land. Once again, to me this makes for a little too convenient ending to the story. The amusing thought of another plane being in worse condition than a P-47 missing half its wing. But in the end, I wasn't able to confirm or discredit this claim either way. When it comes to actual photographic proof, this picture here undeniably shows the A6 Brazilian P-47 missing a large portion of its right wing. But depending on where you find this picture online, the caption for it can vary. As for Lieutenant Raimondo da Costa Canario, to confirm the events happened, it's probably best to focus on him. According to military records, Raimondo completed 51 missions before the war ended, and he returned to Brazil. Based on the pictures I found on Facebook, he met up with his fellow Brazilian fighter pilots from time to time over the years. I was also able to find this painting from a few years before his 1997 passing that seems to corroborate this incredible story. You can see both B4 and A6 are featured in the picture. If the P-47 wing loss tale was exaggerated or fabricated, I would have expected to see it debunked during this time when both Raimondo and the members of his air group were still alive and people were literally making paintings of the event. Thus, personally, I have come to the conclusion that this amazing story did happen. just not in the way it often gets repeated these days. A6 and B4 both survived the war and were returned to Brazil, where they currently reside in a museum. This is a picture of some of Raimundo's descendants with the very plane he flew with half a wing. The caption reads, "If it weren't for the robustness of this P-47, 4 of those in this photo would not exist." If you enjoy incredible but accurate stories about aviation and spaceflight, please subscribe and check out some of my other documentary videos linked here. If you want to support my work while getting access to behind-the-scenes info and exclusive content, you can pledge to my Patreon that's linked in the description. My name is Sledge. Thanks for watching.